Today, roller coasters across the world feature many crazy variations and elements. But sometimes we forget that coasters in the past had to pave the way for such rides, and how some of them were far ahead of the time that they were built in. Today, those rides are getting credit. These are the top 10 coasters that were ahead of their time. Please keep in mind that this list is in no specific order, they are not ranked. Anyway, let's get into it.
Number 10, Magnum Extra Long 200. Yes, XL means extra long, at Cedar Point, an aero hypercoaster. Though it may seem like an average hyper on the surface, this coaster was revolutionary for its time. 10 years prior, the aero mine train on steroids known as Gemini opened at the park, and its success made Cedar Point go right back to aero for their next coaster. Inspired by Bandit at Yomiuri Land, they were looking for a coaster that emphasized great height and speed, rather than inversions which were very popular at the time. The ride was originally planned to be 187 feet tall, until it was suggested to break 200 feet to increase the ride's marketability. With that, the world's first full-circuit hypercoaster was born. This ride's introduction also kicked off the time period dubbed as the Coaster War for many record-breaking coasters that it brought. Magnum was the tallest, fastest, and steepest full-circuit coaster upon its opening, making way for future coasters of the same model from other manufacturers. Magnum would hold on to its records until it was topped by the Pepsi Max Big One in 1994.
Number 9. Schwarzkopf Shuttle Loops and Aero-Launched Shuttle Loops. Long before the creation of the well-known Vekoma Boomerang, companies Schwarzkopf and Aero were making their own coasters that go both forwards and backwards. Both coasters were first installed at parks in 1977, making them among the first coaster models to feature inversions. 3 of the German manufacturer Schwarzkopf's versions opened this year, all featuring interesting weight drop launches before an intense loop, only to do the layout again in reverse. The Aero versions were a bit different. They have a slower launch into a sharp dip before their loop, which then leads back up into another launch, this time sending the train in the opposite direction. The small footprint of the thrilling coasters would cause them to catch on until the 80s, when Vekoma's Boomerang model would steal the show. Still though, that model may not have existed had its predecessors never came to be.
Number 8. Batman the Ride at Six Flags Great America. Today, B&M coasters are ubiquitous. That was not the case back in 1992. Prior to this coaster, B&M had made 3 small-scale stand-up coasters that are all generally considered to be bad rides today. Batman the Ride was different. Prior to Batman the Ride, looping coasters were not very intense and most had jarring transitions, as well as they were really large and were not in the slightest way compact. Batman the Ride changed all of this, all while being the world's first inverted coaster to successfully invert. Batman also made B&M's name known in the coaster industry, causing B&M to go from selling 1 coaster a year before Batman to 3, 4, then 5, then 8, and so on after Batman. The trend continues to this day. Without Batman the Ride, we would not have arguably the greatest coaster manufacturer of all time.
Number 7. The original Bat at Kings Island, a suspended coaster made by, you guessed it, Aerodynamics. For the most part, 1981 didn't have much that was interesting, especially by today's standards. American Eagle became the tallest coaster in the world, but after that there were a few Woodies, some Corkscrew coasters, and some Schwarzkopfs. But then comes the Bat, blowing them all out of the water. It was the first suspended coaster ever built, and while it may not have worked out well, it was no doubt an insane ride, especially compared to everything else that existed at the time. Every turn on the Bat was entirely unbanked, leading to insane G-forces being put on the body, levels of G-force that were previously unheard of. This coaster, along with the others that would join its model in the future, were no doubt inspiration for future inverted and even possibly 4D coasters. Nowadays, suspended coasters are much more reliable than the original, but the Bat was the coaster that first started it all.
Number 6. Corkscrew at Knott's Berry Farm, an aero corkscrew model. This is the coaster that started all of the insane inversions we have today. Opening in 1975, Corkscrew was the first modern roller coaster built with inversions, with 2 corkscrews after a drop and a turnaround. This double corkscrew element has become arguably the most iconic coaster element ever. Corkscrew at Knott's is often overlooked as the first coaster to feature inversions, with some people still under the misconception that this title belongs to Revolution at Six Flags Magic Mountain, or even Corkscrew at Cedar Point. The ride was later relocated to Silverwood in 1989, where it still operates today.
Number 5. Little Dipper at Conneaut Lake Park, an Alan Herschel kiddie coaster. This unsuspecting little ride doesn't look like much, but it actually has quite the historical value. When it opened, it became the first ever devoted kiddie coaster. The kiddie coaster is pretty self-explanatory, being a small ride model with small drops meant for children. However, long before the Zero Tivoli's, Zamperla gravity coasters, and ENF milers we know today, there was Little Dipper. This may be a looked down upon style of coaster nowadays, but there's no doubt that plenty of people have gotten their roller coaster loving start on Conneaut's Little Dipper.
Number 4. Flight of Fear at Kings Island and Kings Dominion, a Premier Rides launch coaster. When Flight of Fear opened in 1996, it was one of the highlight attractions of the year. It had a launch out of the station into complete darkness, with a layout full of inversions and turns, but it was the first element on this coaster that caught the attention of many: the launch. It wasn't the first one. Many had been made before with Schwarzkopf shuttle loops and other models, but this was the first launch to accelerate the train with magnets, using a system known as LIMs, or linear induction motors. It required much more power and electricity than the flywheel and weight drop launches of the past, but it made way for almost all of the launches we see today, which are either LIMs or LSMs. The acceleration was pretty weak on these first clones, going from 0 to 54 miles per hour in 4 seconds, but slowly Premier would figure out how to make the launches more forceful, with Mr. Freeze clones of 1998 hitting 70 miles per hour top speed in just 3.8 seconds. This style of launch has continued to evolve into what we see today.
Number 3. Jackrabbit at Seabreeze Amusement Park, a John Miller and Henry Baker wooden coaster. Jackrabbit is celebrating its 100th year at Seabreeze this year, but without knowing that, you may assume the ride was no more than 50 years old from just looking at it. It has some decent sized drops and some okay looking airtime. All of that is great, but one thing really makes Jackrabbit stand out as revolutionary and ahead of its time. In 1919, John Miller experimented with and came up with a concept for a new type of wheel for coasters. This was called the upstop wheel, and it was first implemented on Jackrabbit the year after in 1920 to prevent the train from flying off of the track when experiencing negative G-force. Although let's be real, this coaster may not have really needed them. Nowadays, there is not a single operating roller coaster manufacturer that doesn't utilize upstop wheels. It's an easy way to better ensure safety, especially with the insane elements that are continually being built. I'm just glad the wheel only stops the train from getting airtime and not the rider.
Number 2. The Great American Revolution at Six Flags Magic Mountain, a Schwarzkopf looping coaster. Here it is, the coaster that everyone seems to believe was the first to invert. We've already mentioned that it was actually Corkscrew at Knott's Berry Farm, but Revolution was the first modern coaster to feature a vertical loop. It also did something in 1976 that is only starting to become popular these days. It was the first modern coaster to ever go upside down with lap bars. What's interesting is that in 1992, the park made the decision of changing the trains to ones with over-the-shoulder restraints. 24 years later, Six Flags Magic Mountain thankfully changed the Revolution's trains back to the original ones with lap bars. It was a big deal for this coaster to go upside down with lap bars, with every other non-Schwarzkopf coaster of the time going upside down only with the use of over-the-shoulder restraints.
Number 1. Scenic Railway at Luna Park. This probably isn't the Luna Park that you're thinking of. Far away from Coney Island is another park by the same name as Luna Park in Australia, and it is home to the oldest operating coaster with a cable lift in Scenic Railway. It may not be exactly what we think of when we think cable lift, with our Intamin hypers and such, but this old thing was doing it just as well, if not better, due to reliability, in 1912. If that's not a coaster that is way ahead of its time, I don't know what is. The train attaches to a thin wire or cable that pulls the train to the top very quickly. The rest of the ride may not be too special, but the lift alone marks this coaster as extremely innovative. That's gonna do it for this video. A massive shout out goes to To Enthusiast for being willing to collaborate with me on this project. If you aren't already subscribed to him, go check his channel out, It will be linked in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, and I will see you guys next time.